Welcome to Presidential Fight Club, the show that answers the question, if all 44 presidents fought each other one-on-one, who would win? Hosted by two history professors who have too much time on their hands, Scott Rank and James Early. Welcome to the second fight in the Final Four. In the last one, Teddy Roosevelt was narrowly victorious against Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is out. Teddy Roosevelt advances to the finals. One more contestant will meet Teddy there. He's going to square off against a general, no matter who wins this fight, because we have two generals fighting, George Washington and Dwight D. Eisenhower. James, why will the father of our country be victorious, you think?
The father of our country was almost insane when he was in combat. Fearless to the point of foolhardy and insane. When he was a young man, we mentioned this before, but I think it bears repeating. When he was 22 years old, he was a major, later became a colonel in the Virginia militia, and he was ordered out to try to get the French, or actually not try to get them, to command them, to order them in the name of Virginia to stop building a fort, which became known as Fort Duquesne. It's on the side of modern-day Pittsburgh. Washington leads a small group out there, and he's told no, and pretty soon he gets in a fight with them, and he loses, and they send him home. And then he comes back again. This time he's not in command. The British send a larger force of British regulars, assisted by some Virginia militia, and they're led by a man named General Braddock, and Washington is kind of one of his aides, and they're ambushed, and people are shooting at them from the woods. A combined force of Indians and French are shooting them. General Braddock gets killed. Washington he's nearly hit probably at least half a dozen times. I can't remember exactly how many. I don't know if anybody knows for sure, but his hat has a hole in it. His coat has multiple holes in it. He gets a horse shot out from under him. And once Braddock is killed and it looks very obvious that his force is going to lose, he rallies them and takes them back to Virginia, basically. And he writes a letter later to someone, and I forget who he wrote it to. I don't have it in front of me right now, but he wrote a letter and he said, "I've heard the sound of bullets whistling around, and I tell you, there's something charming about the sound." And it's just like,
he has an addiction to war.
Yeah, most people don't like the sound of bullets whizzing around their head. I've never heard it. I hope I never do in my entire life, but most people duck and most people run. Not George. He just keeps on marching and he thinks it's kind of cool, wing, wing, zoom, zoom. Just keeps on insanely fighting. And then later, of course, he, in the Revolutionary War, he leads the colonial army, the Continental Army, I should say, around, and he gets beat more times than he wins. But he also is sneaky. He leads a surprise attack on the city of Trenton, New Jersey, on Christmas Day, crosses a river, which is full of ice. It's freezing cold, and they surprise the soldiers. They're not British, actually. They're Germans. They're Hessian mercenaries, and he surprises them, and they defeat them, and then he turns around later and attacks Princeton and defeats that as well, and probably saves his army. His army was starting to fade away, and it wasn't like it was this great strategic victory, but it was a moral victory. It really boosted the morale of the troops, and people stuck around after that. And Washington, as a commander, was not a brilliant battlefield tactician. He wasn't necessarily like a Napoleon or a George Patton or a Stonewall Jackson or anything like that. His greatness was in the fact that he refused to give up, and he was a great leader of men. He was able to persuade people not to give up and not to go home. But he was also personally tough. He was a great horse rider. He was in very good shape. People said he was in terrific shape even when he was in his 40s. And he was strong. We don't know that he did a lot of fighting or wrestling or boxing or anything like that. So that may hurt him a little bit. But one thing that's going for him is he's also very tall. He's 6'2", about 200 pounds or so. And he's got a long arm reach, and he is just, as we've said, he's fearless. You can punch him, you can kick him, whatever, and he's just going to keep coming back at you. He's not going to stop. He refuses to give up. So I think that's why Washington has an excellent chance in this semifinal match.
Okay, I have my work cut out for me. Eisenhower. Just in terms of physical matchup, he's shorter, 5'10", about 180, 4 inches shorter than Washington. This is an interesting fight. I'll have to compare him to Washington on multiple points. In a lot of our previous battles, usually it's somebody who's a drunk and spends plenty of time with his mistress versus a war commander, and there's not really much of a debate. Here is where Ike, I think, could excel, and it has to do with the evolution of military combat over the centuries. And this is something where the displacement in time really does make a difference. You can see this in all sorts of athletic competitions. For example, in wrestling, I'm from Iowa, where wrestling is very popular in high school and college. And the techniques now that a modern wrestler could destroy someone from 40 years ago, how much more so somebody from 200 years ago when we're talking about the military? So here's how I would say this matchup with Eisenhower and Washington. Now, Washington comes at a time in the late 18th century where a lot of the training that a soldier would receive beyond formations, firing, and other things, when it actually came to close quarter combat, when you weren't firing, you would do bayonet fencing. This comes out of the evolution of when personal firearms are introduced into fighting amongst European armies in the early modern period. You would have men with firearms, but they were notoriously slow to load, and they'd be supported by pikemen, these large pikes. Over time, you would have a bayonet at the end of your weapon so that, in a sense, you're both a rifleman and a pikeman at the same time. Now, by the time you get up to Eisenhower's day, they are trained in using multiple implements. You have your rifle, you have larger artillery. You can also be trained with your fists. So Eisenhower has a training Washington does not have. Just a couple of stories to highlight this. We mentioned what a great athlete Ike was when he was younger. He made the varsity football team in high school. He was a starter as a running back and linebacker in 1912. He tackles Jim Thorpe in a game, but he suffers a torn knee later on and re-injures his knee on horseback, so he turned to fencing and gymnastics. But he was an excellent boxer. So here's just one story that blew me away. At one point during a furlough from West Point, he fought a one-time professional fighter named Dirk Tyler in Abilene, Kansas, where Ike is from. He was one of the few African-American men in mostly white Abilene. So Tyler's modest success at fisticuffs had turned him into sort of a local bully, and he bragged that he'd never been beaten by anyone in town. While Eisenhower also had a reputation as a fighter due to his boxing experience, and this led to a confrontation. One day, Ike was getting a haircut in a barber shop, and Tyler was working here as a porter. So Tyler announced he was ready and willing to meet him anywhere, anytime. Ike couldn't resist the challenge. He couldn't avoid it, really, and he agreed to fight Tyler in the basement of a department store across the street. Tyler was bigger in size, and he's bigger than Eisenhower, and he thought that his only chance to win was to outbox him. So Tyler's advantage was, whatever his size advantage was, it was nullified when he came out to flailing punches that were easily telegraphed. Eisenhower could see them. So Tyler was always leaving his jaw unprotected, and the fight ended really shortly. Eisenhower was able to win despite his injured knee, and Tyler was flattened by a series of counterblows to the jaw and crumpled to the floor. So what Eisenhower said later on about the fight was, "I went out determined to use every bit of skill to protect myself, and then to find the boy didn't know the first thing about fighting. He telegraphed his punches from a mile away. Poor Dirk. Honestly, I've never been particularly proud of that scrap." So Eisenhower feels bad that he beat up a former professional boxer too much, despite having an injured knee. So that's his fighting ability. Of course, he is a genius commander. He didn't have an distinguished military background before World War II. He was a lieutenant colonel for a long time. But then in a period of 16 months, he's catapulted to the ranks of a 4-star general, and he's responsible for winning or losing the war in the Mediterranean with the Allied campaign in North Africa. This is a thing that shows off strengths and weaknesses of Eisenhower as a commander. But he was the only person that could really hold together the alliance between Great Britain and the United States. But he also had skills as seeing the global view of how to maintain a fight with D-Day, with Operation Overlord. Now, Washington maybe could have the advantage where Washington would think more in 2 dimensions when fighting, Whereas Eisenhower, now he has aerial support, he has paratroopers, he has bombing runs, he has to think in 3 dimensions. So in a one-on-one fist fight, that could be an advantage to Washington. But Eisenhower has to keep multiple hundreds, thousands of pieces of this gigantic chessboard of the European theater in his mind. So using those awesome powers of his mind to handle that, how much more could he do so in a one-on-one fist fight? And Washington doesn't have a bayonet, so I think Ike is going to be able to land the fatal blow. But does he? What do you think, James?
This was a very, very close one. I mean, if it were a boxing match, it would go 15 rounds. It was tough. They were pummeling each other away. But in the end, once again, that direct or actual experience of boxing as opposed to just general toughness is going to prevail. Washington doesn't seem to have been especially gifted at throwing punches. I'm sure, I mean, I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of one, but he just didn't have that boxing training and the football and all the other athleticism, targeted athleticism that Dwight Eisenhower has. So Ike wins. It's really close. And there was a loud vocal Washington minority that said he got robbed. But in the end, the victory went to Ike.
The final bicuspid of Washington, or whatever tooth he had remaining that held in his dentures, is knocked out.
That's right. Poor old George.
So there it goes. Well, wow. We have the two final contenders in the Presidential Fight Club, Teddy Roosevelt versus Eisenhower. So this is going to be a brutal match. We're going to see how the Supreme Allied Commander goes up against he who speaks softly and carries a big stick. So we will see you in the final match. Thanks for listening to Presidential Fight Club. If you'd like to download your own printable bracket sheets for each regional tournament so you can guess how the tournament will go, check out presidentialfightclub.com. We'd appreciate it if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts as well. Thanks for listening, and may you fight with the stamina of Teddy Roosevelt, the courage of George Washington, and the reach of Abraham Lincoln.